Good morning and welcome. This presentation will look at men and women of OECD and non-OECD countries and which of these people are the more religious. To gain a better understanding of the study, it is important to define what an OECD and non-OECD country is. OECD stands for Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. An OECD country is more commonly known as a developed country. It has economies generating high income and possesses a high human development index, which incorporates decent education rates and income and a high life expectancy. Non-OECD countries do not yet meet this particular criteria and are more commonly referred to as countries of the developing world. The interest behind this study was to identify social patterns in religiosity in poorer and developed countries and to discover if it was the men or women who are the more religious. According to a social scientific study done by the Global Index of Religiosity and Atheism 2012, religion is valued much higher by poor people who mainly occupy non-OECD countries. Of these people, women in non-OECD countries are the more religious, and men are generally the more irreligious group. Women, however, tend to receive more religious prejudice, especially those in non-OECD countries. And in several major religions, women are also considered inferior to men, with leadership positions being quite limited, particularly in poorer countries. Though this doesn't state that men are more religious than women, it indicates that religion is a male-dominated realm. However, despite this, the literature supports the hypothesis that women are more religious than men, specifically those of poor countries. To confirm if this hypothesis was correct, data was collected from the World Values Survey and analysed through SPSS to see if the statistics would support the hypothesis. To obtain a cross-tabulation was the first step in data analysis. The split file function was selected in order to split OECD and non-OECD variables from each other. Bivariate analysis was then undertaken and used to generate this cross-tabulation. OECD and non-OECD countries, men and women, and atheist, non-religious and religious classifications are the variables being examined in this study. All are categorical, therefore the mode is used as the measure of central tendency. Three main sections have been highlighted in the table. The orange section highlights the OECD variable, the green section emphasises the non-OECD variable, and the yellow section on the bottom right-hand corner indicates that 55,045 people underwent this survey, and that all of these people undertook it, as indicated by the 100% mark. For OECD men, it can be seen that 41.5% of males are religious, 51.1% are not religious, and 58.4% are atheist. This states that more men in OECD countries identify as atheist or not religious than men who identify as religious. For OECD women, 58.5% claim they are religious, 48.9% are not religious, and 41.6% are atheist. This highlights that there are more religious women in OECD countries, with a visible decrease seen in women who are not religious or atheist. In the non-OECD section, 45.2% of males identify as religious, 55% are not religious, and 61.3% are atheist. This follows a similar pattern seen in men in OECD countries. More men are atheist or not religious than men who are religious. For women who underwent this survey living within non-OECD countries, 54.8% say they are religious, 45% are not religious, and 38.7% are atheist. These facts state that more women living in underdeveloped countries are religious. This again emphasises a close pattern seen in women of developed countries. Out of all these groups, there is a social pattern among the women of both OECD and non-OECD countries. The data indicates that women are generally the more religious and supports the initial hypothesis made from the literature. To explore this more visually, the remaining data in the cross-tabulation table was then taken and transformed into three graphs. Graph 1 first examines the populations of the people who underwent this survey, who live in OECD and non-OECD countries. In this table, it is clear how many more people live in the developing world. 21,611 more men live in non-OECD countries compared to men living in OECD countries, and 23,457 more women are living in non-OECD countries compared to women living in OECD countries. It can be concluded from this data that there are significantly more people living in the developing world who undertook this survey. It can also be seen that there are more women who undertook this survey in both non-OECD and OECD countries. Graph 2 highlights the religious affiliation of people within OECD countries. Between religious and not religious men, there is not much of a difference. This difference, however, is obvious in women. We can see that in OECD countries, women tend to be more religious than men, and more women than men identify as religious, and less women than men identify themselves as not religious or atheist. The data presented in this graph not only supports the initial hypothesis and literature outlined earlier, but it also supports the data provided from the cross-tabulation. Graph 3 looks at religious affiliation in non-OECD countries. It is clearly seen again how much higher the population is in these countries. Another aspect that can be seen is how many more women are religious than men in non-OECD countries. Less women than men identify themselves as not religious or atheist, while more women than men identify themselves as religious. This follows a similar pattern seen in Table 2 regarding women of OECD countries. A significant drop or positive skewness is seen from the religious to the non-religious and then to the atheist in men and women of non-OECD countries. This drop is not so significant in the graph that highlighted OECD countries and religious affiliation. What this observation highlights is that the mode is higher than the mean and median, indicating that essentially people in non-OECD countries are more religious than people in OECD countries. In order to ensure that the data mentioned is significant and accurately represents the population being examined, a Kramer's V-test was run due to there being more than 2 variables explored. The Kramer's V-test also tested the correlational value of the data. The table below was generated by SPSS after the test was run. The red box highlights the portion that specifies the significance of the data. With a significance level of 0.000 from the Kramer's V-test for both OECD and non-OECD variables, this indicates that the data collected and information presented is accurately reflective of the entire population. The blue box highlights that, according to the Kramer's V-test, the correlational value of the data was weak, with it being 12% for the OECD variable and 9.6% for the non-OECD variable. However, we can see from the cross-tabulation tables and the generated graphs that 3 specific social patterns are indeed evident. 1, people from non-OECD countries are more religious. 2, women from non-OECD countries are the more religious group out of all others being studied. And 3, men in non-OECD and OECD countries are less religious than women in these 2 categories. Conclusively, the statistics found support the literature mentioned above that women of non-OECD countries are indeed more religious than the other groups researched. The data also supports the information collected by the Global Index of Religiosity and Atheism, stating that people within non-OECD countries are more religious. This therefore supports the hypothesis made. With this conclusion, it is worth exploring why women are more religious than men. According to a study conducted by researcher Sunita Gupta and her colleagues, participation in religious exercises increases levels of satisfaction of life of women. Many women also believe that such activities enhance peace of mind and mental well-being. A positive mental state can influence one's immunity and therefore contribute toward improved health. According to another study conducted by Bruce and Treza Biatowska in 2012, despite social exclusion and in many religions being classed as inferior, social differences from men and women such as childbirth, rearing children, outlooks on life and death, illness, well-being and perceptions of the body are also factors responsible for women likely to pray and worship more than men. It also holds responsibility for women being more likely to claim that their faith is important to them. This concludes the presentation, and thank you for listening.